Episode 6, Did Women Benefit from the Renaissance? An AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Miles, and today we're doing something a little different. We're not just telling a story, we're arguing about one. And honestly, this feels kind of like cross-country strategy. You can look at the same race and say, that was a great run, or no, that pacing was terrible, depending on what you value.
That's actually a very appropriate comparison, Miles. Historians often look at the same period and come to very different conclusions based on what questions they ask.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of where I'm at right now, like, Renaissance equals good, right? Art, ideas, Michelangelo, Leonardo, this big cultural glow-up for Europe. So how is this even a debate?
The Renaissance glow-up. I like that. But yeah, that's exactly the problem. For a long time, historians treated the Renaissance as this universal upgrade, like everyone in Europe got better graphics, better dialogue, better everything.
So they didn't?
Not necessarily. And that's where today's question comes in. Did women benefit from the Renaissance? Or did things actually get worse for them in some ways?
And this is not just a content question, it's a historiographical one. We're looking at how historians interpret the past differently. Two major historians, Margaret L. King and Joan Kelly-Goodall, look at the same period and reach very different conclusions.
Okay, so this is like two different takes on the same race film.
Exactly.
All right, so who's saying what?
Margaret L. King argues that women, especially elite women, did benefit from the Renaissance. She points to increased visibility, cultural participation, and a growing sense of identity among women.
And Joan Kelly-Goodall basically says, not so fast. She argues that women actually lost power and freedom compared to the Middle Ages.
Wait, lost ground during the Renaissance?
Yep, that's the debate.
All right, let's start with the yes side. What does it look like if women did benefit?
King's argument focuses heavily on elite women, queens, noblewomen, and educated women connected to courts. She highlights figures like Joan of Arc, Catherine de' Medici, Elizabeth I, and Isabella d'Este.
Okay, I know Joan of Arc. That's the armor, leading armies, burned at the stake.
Exactly. And King uses Joan of Arc as a symbol of women who stepped into roles traditionally reserved for men. She's not saying all women became military leaders, obviously, but that the Renaissance created space, at least for some women, to act in new ways.
So, like, exceptions?
Exceptional individuals, yes, but historically significant ones. For example, Catherine de' Medici ruled as a regent in France and played a major political role. Elizabeth I ruled England for decades and carefully crafted her public image to maintain authority.
That whole, I have the body of a woman but the heart of a king thing?
Exactly. That's Elizabeth navigating a world where female rule was seen as unnatural. She had to present herself as both feminine and masculine at the same time. And that's key. She's the exception, not the rule. The fact that Elizabeth works as a ruler doesn't mean the system supports women. It means she's extraordinary enough to survive within a system that generally doesn't.
That sounds exhausting.
It probably was.
King also emphasizes cultural influence. Many women acted as patrons of the arts and learning. Isabella d'Este, for example, supported artists, collected works, and helped shape Renaissance culture. She corresponded with major intellectuals, commissioned works from leading artists, and helped define what counted as Renaissance culture in the first place.
And it's not just patronage. King also points to women who participated directly in intellectual life, writing letters, engaging in debates, and studying humanist subjects like Latin and rhetoric. Figures like Isotta Nogarola or Laura Sirita were part of these humanist networks.
So they're not just funding culture, they're actually part of the conversation.
Exactly. And King argues that this represents a shift in how some women saw themselves, not just as daughters or wives, but as thinkers.
So instead of painting the Sistine Chapel, they're the ones paying for it?
That's a great way to put it. Patronage is power, just not always direct political power.
And importantly, it's often indirect and temporary. Women could exercise influence, especially as regents or through sons, but that power rarely passed through female lines or became permanent authority.
Okay, so King's argument is basically, women are more visible, more involved, more culturally important.
Yes, And she also argues that women developed a stronger sense of themselves as intellectual and cultural participants.
So, like, early feminism?
Early versions of it, yes. Not modern feminism, but the beginnings of women thinking of themselves as thinkers, writers, and contributors.
King also emphasizes something more subtle: consciousness. Some women begin to see themselves as intellectual actors, as part of a cultural world, even if their formal power remains limited.
All right, that sounds pretty convincing. So, what's the no argument?
Joan Kelly Goodall challenges the entire idea that the Renaissance was a positive turning point for women. She asks a very important question: are historical turning points the same for men and women?
Oh, that's kind of a big question.
It is. And her answer is basically no. She argues that while men experienced new opportunities during the Renaissance, women, especially elite women, actually experienced a decline in power and independence.
How?
She points to several major changes. First, the rise of the modern state and early capitalism reorganized society in ways that limited women's roles. As political authority became more centralized, power moved into formal institutions that were overwhelmingly controlled by men.
And economically, changes in trade and production began to push women out of certain forms of work. In some cities, women lost access to guild participation or independent economic roles they may have had earlier. A great example comes from the work of historian Judith Bennett on Brewsters, women who brewed and sold ale in medieval Europe. In the late Middle Ages, brewing was often small-scale and done in households, so women could run these businesses. But as brewing became more commercialized and capital-intensive during the early modern period, men increasingly took over the trade, and women were pushed out or relegated to lower status roles.
So, something that used to be normal work for women becomes not their space anymore?
Exactly. The work didn't disappear. It just shifted in a way that excluded them. And that's a pattern Kelly Goodall is pointing to more broadly.
So, even if the economy is growing, women aren't necessarily benefiting from it.
Exactly.
Limited how?
Women were increasingly excluded from political and economic power. Their roles became more confined to the household.
And culturally, there was a shift in how women were expected to behave. Renaissance writers emphasized chastity, obedience, and passivity for women.
That doesn't sound like a glow-up.
Not exactly.
Kelly Goodall also talks about something called the sexual double standard. Men could have extramarital relationships, but women were expected to remain strictly chaste.
So, different rules for men and women.
Yes, and she argues that this became more pronounced during the Renaissance. She also outlines a set of criteria to measure women's status, things like control over sexuality, access to property, participation in politics, and cultural influence, and argues that in many of these areas, women experience greater restriction.
And one of her most interesting points is about ideology, how literature and art reflect and reinforce these roles. When you look at Renaissance texts, women are often portrayed as passive, chaste, and dependent, even when they appear in elite settings.
What about that whole court culture thing, like knights and romance and all that?
Great question. In the Middle Ages, courtly love traditions sometimes gave noble women a certain degree of agency in relationships. But in the Renaissance, those relationships became more controlled and more symbolic. And this is one of Kelly Goodall's biggest arguments. Compared to the Middle Ages, some women actually lose ground. Earlier traditions allowed for more reciprocity in relationships, but Renaissance norms emphasize hierarchy and control.
Symbolic how?
Think about Baldassare Castiglione's Book of the Courtier. It lays out the ideal behavior for men and women at court. Men are active, warriors, diplomats, thinkers. Women are expected to be graceful, beautiful, and entertaining.
So, vibes manager?
Exactly. The woman's role is to enhance the court, not to lead it.
And this reflects a broader shift Kelly Goodall identifies: the separation of public and private life. Men dominate politics, economics, and intellectual life in the public sphere, while women are increasingly confined to the private, domestic world. In the Book of the Courtier, the ideal woman is educated and graceful, but her purpose is to please, to inspire, and to reflect male achievement, not to act independently. Kelly Gattel contrasts this with earlier medieval traditions, particularly courtly love, where noble women sometimes held more symbolic power in relationships. In her view, the Renaissance replaces that with a more rigid hierarchy.
So it looks more polished, but it's actually more restrictive.
That's exactly her argument.
That feels like a downgrade.
That's precisely Kelly Gattel's point. Even when women appear to have cultural roles, those roles are often limited and defined by men.
In fact, she argues that Renaissance culture often turns women into aesthetic objects, symbols of beauty, virtue, or inspiration, rather than independent actors shaping events.
So even if they're present, they're not really in control.
Correct.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this. King says women gained visibility and influence, especially elite women. Kelly Gattel says they actually lost power and became more restricted.
That's a good summary.
So, who's right?
That's not really the goal here.
It isn't?
Historians are less interested in picking a winner and more interested in understanding complexity.
So both can be true? So are we basically saying the Renaissance might expand women's visibility in culture, but restrict their actual power in politics and economics?
Yes. For example, elite women might gain cultural visibility while still losing political or economic independence.
So like, you get more attention but less actual power?
Exactly.
What about non-elite women? Like not queens or nobles?
That's another important point. Both historians focus heavily on elite women because those are the sources we have. But for most women, peasants, artisans, the Renaissance likely did not dramatically improve their daily lives.
If anything, many of those women continued to face economic hardship, limited rights, and strict social expectations.
So the Renaissance might look very different depending on who you are.
Exactly, class matters.
So this isn't just a yes or no question, it's more like, it depends.
Welcome to history.
That's honestly kind of frustrating.
It can be. But it's also what makes it interesting.
Yeah, I guess. It's like trying to decide if a race went well. You have to ask, what was the goal? Who are we talking about? What counts as success?
Precisely. And historians are constantly redefining those questions.
All right, so if I had to sum this up, King is saying the Renaissance gave some women new opportunities, especially in culture and intellectual life. Kelly Gattel is saying those gains were limited and came with bigger losses in power and independence.
That's a strong synthesis.
I feel like I'm not supposed to pick a side, but it kind of sounds like both are right depending on what you're looking at.
That's exactly the kind of thinking we want.
Now I have to figure out if I'm actually going to ask someone to homecoming.
That may require a different kind of analysis.
Yeah, I don't think historiography is going to help me there.
You never know.
All right, that's going to do it for today. Next time in episode 7, we're heading into one of the biggest turning points in European history, the Reformation. We'll start with Martin Luther and the early challenges to the Catholic Church.
A major shift in religious and political structures.
And a moment that will reshape everyday life across Europe.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.